The courtroom was filled with an uneasy stillness, the kind that settles over a room when everyone knows something important is about to happen. Wooden benches creaked softly as people shifted in their seats waiting for the judge to speak. The air felt heavy, as though every breath carried the weight of judgment. On one side of the room, lawyers whispered quietly to their clients. On the other side, reporters held their pens ready, eager to capture every word. In the middle of this room stood a teenager. He was young, too young to be dressed in the bright orange jumpsuit that marked him as a prisoner. His hands were cuffed, but his face showed no fear. Instead, his eyes looked straight ahead, steady and determined. He was not broken, though many expected him to be. The boy's name carried little meaning to the world outside, but inside this courtroom, he was the center of everything. People whispered about him. Some saw him as a criminal, others saw him as a victim of a system that often punished people like him too harshly. He stood silently, listening to the hum of whispers that floated through the courtroom like a low storm. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes, adjusted his glasses and looked down at the papers before him, cleared his throat in the room. Instantly fell silent. Everyone knew what was coming. The moment of judgment had arrived. The boy glanced around the courtroom. He saw strangers staring at him, waiting for his downfall. He saw people nodding quietly, already convinced of his guilt. But he also saw a few faces filled with sorrow, people who believed he deserved another chance. Somewhere in the back, a woman wiped tears from her eyes, though she tried to hide it. For a moment, the teenager thought about everything that had brought him here, the mistakes, the choices, and the accusations that had piled up until they felt like a mountain pressing down on him. But he also thought about something else, something stronger than fear. He thought about his family, thought about his father. The bailiff called for silence again. The judge raised his gavel, a wooden hammer that seemed to carry the power to decide the boy's entire future. The sound of it striking the desk would seal his fate. Everyone leaned forward, holding their breath. But before the judge spoke, the boy took a deep breath. He knew the world expected him to break down, to cry or beg for mercy, but he refused. He stood tall, his eyes calm, his back straight. He wanted the court to see not just a teenager in chains, but a person with dignity, someone who would not let despair win. The judge's voice finally broke the silence. This court has reviewed the case. Evidence has been presented. The arguments have been made. The decision of this court is as follows. His words echoed through the room, each syllable carrying the weight of finality. The teenager's heart beat faster. He could hear it pounding in his ears. Time seemed to slow down. Every second felt like an eternity. He thought of his childhood, of laughter in the park, of late-night studying, of moments when he had dreamed of something better. He thought of promises he had made to himself that no matter how hard life became, he would never give up. And now, standing in front of the entire courtroom, he knew those promises were being tested. The judge paused for a long moment. His eyes rested on the boy, and for a brief second, there was almost a flicker of hesitation in his expression. But then his face hardened again, and he raised the gavel. In the matter of this case, the judge said firmly, the court sentences the defendant to life in prison. Gasps erupted from the courtroom. Some people shook their heads. Others whispered in shock. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. The bailiff stepped forward to escort the teenager away, but the boy did not move. He did not cry, did not protest. He simply lowered his head for a moment, then lifted it again with quiet strength. He was not defeated, not yet. The courtroom's silence returned, heavier than before. Everyone watched as the boy slowly turned toward the judge. His lips pressed together, but his eyes spoke louder than words. They spoke of resilience, of courage, of a spirit that refused to break. And in that silence, something remarkable happened. Instead of sinking into despair, the boy took a small step forward. He asked for something simple, something every person in custody is granted a single phone call. The judge nodded, perhaps curious, perhaps indifferent. The request was allowed. The bailiff handed the boy a phone. The entire courtroom held its breath, expecting him to call a friend or a relative to share the devastating news. But as the boy dialed, his voice steady, He spoke words that made the entire room freeze. "Dad," said into the phone, his voice calm but filled with meaning. "They sentenced me. I need you." The room grew tense. No one knew who he was speaking to. Some assumed it was just his father, a man sitting somewhere outside the courtroom, powerless to change the outcome. But then the boy's next words shattered the silence and sent shockwaves through the room. "Dad," said clearly, so that everyone could hear, "you are the U.S. Attorney General. I need you now." The courtroom erupted in gasps. Reporters nearly dropped their pens. Lawyers turned pale. Even the judge's face faltered, the mask of authority slipping for just a moment. The teenager lowered the phone slowly, his eyes calm, but his heart burning with hope. For the first time since the gavel struck, the power in the room shifted. This was no longer just the story of a boy being sentenced. This was the beginning of something larger, something that would challenge the very system that had just condemned him. And so, in that heavy silence, the story truly began. The sound of the gavel still echoed in the boy's mind as if the wooden hammer had struck not just the desk, but his entire future. The words had been spoken, final and unforgiving. Life. In prison. To many in the courtroom, it was simply another verdict, another case closed, another number added to the long list of convictions that filled the system every year. But to the young boy standing in the center of that room, those words were meant to bury him alive inside walls of steel and concrete, walls that would try to silence his voice and erase his name. He stood still, his shoulders squared, though his wrists were still cuffed. His chest rose and fell steadily. There were no tears on his face, no cries of protest. He had promised himself that if this moment came, he would not let them see him break. He would stand with dignity, because dignity was the one thing no sentence could take away from him. Around him the courtroom erupted with sound. Some people shook their heads in pity. Others whispered with satisfaction, as though justice had been served in front of their eyes. Reporters leaned forward, already writing headlines about a teenager sentenced to life. To them, it was a story that would sell. To the judge, it was the end of a case. To the lawyers, it was a win or a loss to be recorded in their files. But to the boy, it was not the end. It was the beginning of something larger, something he could not yet explain but could feel rising deep inside of him. The bailiff stepped closer, ready to guide him out of the courtroom and toward the transport that would carry him to a holding cell. For a brief moment, he almost allowed it. He almost let his feet move where they wanted him to go. But then he remembered who he was. He remembered who his father was. Remembered that his life was not meant to end inside a courtroom where his voice had barely been heard. So instead of walking quietly, he raised his head and spoke. His voice was calm but steady, and it cut through the noise in the room like a blade. He asked for his right to a single phone call. There was nothing unusual about the request. Every prisoner was given this right, and so the judge gave a small nod without protest. Perhaps he thought the boy would call his mother, or perhaps a friend who could comfort him with words of sympathy. Perhaps the judge expected tears, begging, desperation. But none of that came. The boy held the phone with steady hands, his eyes locked forward. And when the line connected, he spoke words that made the entire room fall silent once again. "Dad," he said, his tone calm and strong. "They sentenced me. I need you." For a second, the silence was filled with confusion. Reporters leaned closer. Lawyers exchanged puzzled glances, and the judge squinted as though trying to catch the details. The boy spoke again, louder this time, so that the truth would be heard by every single person in the room. "Dad, you are the United States Attorney General. I need you now." The words fell into the courtroom like a thunderclap. Pens stopped. Scratching on paper. A woman in the back gasped loudly. A man whispered a curse under his breath. And the judge froze, his gavel still in his hand, but his authority suddenly shaken. No one had expected this. They had all seen the boy as powerless. Another young man caught in a system too large for him to fight. But now, that system trembled because the father of the boy was the highest official of justice in the nation. This was no ordinary phone call. This was a call that could shift power, that could turn headlines into a national storm, that could transform a personal tragedy into a public reckoning. The teenager lowered the phone slowly, his eyes never leaving the judge's face. He had said what needed to be said. He had reminded the courtroom that he was not alone, that he was not voiceless, and that justice was not a game to be played without accountability. The bailiff hesitated, unsure whether to continue escorting him away or to wait for instructions. Reporters began whispering frantically, some already drafting new leads for their stories. What had seemed like the close of a case had suddenly become the opening of a far larger battle. The judge cleared his throat, but the sound caught slightly as though his voice no longer carried the same weight it had only minutes earlier. He glanced at the boy, then at the stunned faces around the room, then back at the boy again. For a long moment no one moved. The boy's heart was pounding, but his face remained calm. He thought of his father, a man who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of justice, a man who had stood in front of the nation and promised fairness and integrity. And now his own son had been sentenced under the same system he had sworn to protect. It was not just unfair, it was personal. The boy knew his father would come. He knew his father would not stay silent. The silence stretched until finally the bailiff received a nod from the judge to continue. The teenager was escorted out of the courtroom, but the energy of the room had completely shifted. People no longer saw him as a boy defeated by a life sentence. They saw him as the spark of something greater, a challenge to the very heart of justice in the country. As the heavy doors of the courtroom closed behind him, the whispers rose again. Some spoke in disbelief, others spoke in fear, and a few spoke in hope. The sentence had been given, but the story was far from over. What had begun as a routine trial was now unfolding into a national test of truth and fairness. And at the center of it all was a boy who had refused to break, and a father whose voice could shake the walls of the system itself. The echo of the gavel still lingered in the boy's memory, but he held on to something stronger than fear. He held on to the belief that justice was not finished, that the story was not yet written, and that sometimes even the heaviest sentence could be the first step toward freedom. Asterisk. The boy's footsteps echoed against the narrow hallway as the bailiff led him away from the courtroom. Sound was hollow, each step carrying the weight of a sentence that had been stamped upon his life. His wrists were still cuffed, the metal biting against his skin, but his spirit had not been chained. He had made the call. He had spoken the words that no one expected, words that had already begun to ripple through the walls of the courthouse. Somewhere in that building, people were still whispering in disbelief that the teenager who had just been condemned to life in prison was the son of the United States Attorney General. The doors closed behind him, shutting out the gasps and murmurs, but the sound of his own voice on that phone still rang inside his mind. "Dad, I need you." They led him into a holding room, plain and gray, a temporary stop before the transport to the facility where he would be kept. The air smelled of metal and dust, and the silence in the room pressed down on him like a weight. He sat on a bench, his hands resting in his lap, and he allowed himself to breathe. It was not the deep, heavy breathing of a man defeated, but the calm breathing of someone who knew the story was not over. For a moment, he closed his eyes and thought of his father. He pictured him sitting in his office, surrounded by files and reports. The nation's problems stacked on his desk, but the boy knew that no matter how heavy those burdens were, his father would drop everything when he heard his son's voice. And then, it's almost as if fate was listening, the phone in the holding room rang. The guard glanced at him, surprised, then handed him the receiver. The boy lifted it to his ear, his heart steady, his face calm. "Son," came the voice on the other end, deep and firm. It was the voice of a man who had stood in front of cameras, who had spoken to senators and presidents, who had carried the weight of an entire nation on his shoulders. But tonight it was not the voice of the Attorney General. It was the voice of a father. "I heard what happened," his father said, his words steady but lined with emotion. "I am on my way." For the first time that day, the boy allowed himself the smallest smile. It was not a smile of victory or arrogance, but a quiet smile of hope. "I knew you would come," he said softly. His father's voice grew firmer. "Listen to me. They may think this is over, but it has only just begun. You are my son, and I will not let injustice define your life. Hold your head high, because the truth will rise." The line clicked as the call ended, but the words burned in his chest like fire. Moments later, the sound of commotion outside the holding room reached his ears. The courthouse doors had opened, and footsteps echoed loudly in the hallway. Journalists scrambled for position. The weight of authority entered the building as the Attorney General himself stepped inside. The man was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his presence commanding. He was not there as a politician, not there as a public figure seeking the attention of cameras. He was there as a father answering his son's call. His eyes were sharp, his jaw set, his movements swift and precise. The guards straightened at his presence, unsure whether to salute or simply step aside. When he entered the room, the boy rose from the bench. For a moment, time seemed to pause. Father and son faced each other, one in an orange jumpsuit, with cuffs on his wrists, the other in a suit that carried the weight of the nation's laws. But between them, there was no barrier, no distance. The bond was stronger than the walls around them. The Attorney General placed his hand on his son's shoulder, firm but reassuring. "I am here now," he said simply. Those 4 words carried more strength than any gavel, more power than any sentence. Outside the room, whispers filled the courthouse like a storm. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and officials exchanged worried glances. They all knew what this meant. The case was no longer just a local matter. It was no longer just a teenager in trouble. It was now tied directly to the highest office of justice in the country. The boy's call had changed everything. The system that had expected him to quietly disappear into the shadows of a prison now found itself. Standing under the brightest light of scrutiny, the father turned to the guards. His voice was calm, but it carried an authority that made no one dare to interrupt. "I will be reviewing this case personally," he said. "This is not the end. This is only the beginning." The guards shifted uncomfortably, aware that the power dynamics in the room had shifted. The judge's words no longer felt final. The boy's sentence no longer felt sealed. Something greater was moving now. No one could stop it. The boy stood tall beside his father, his eyes shining with determination. He had faced the heaviest blow the system could deliver, and instead of collapsing, he had called upon the one person who could stand taller than that blow. He had refused to let despair win. His call was not only for himself, it was for every person who had ever felt crushed by unfair judgment, for every voice that had been silenced. And so in that gray holding room, surrounded by cold walls and watchful eyes, the story turned. The gavel had fallen, the sentence had been spoken, but the call had awakened something far stronger. The boy's words had carried across the courtroom, across the state, and now across the nation. What had seemed like the end was now the spark of a beginning that would challenge everything people believed about justice, fairness, and truth. The boy lifted his chin and looked directly at his father. "I am ready," he said. His father nodded, his eyes steady. "Then let us show them what justice really means." The call had been made. The call had been answered. And the world was about to change. The courthouse was no longer just a building of wood and stone. It had turned into the beating heart of a storm. The air outside was thick with voices, reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing, the crowd pressing forward in hopes of witnessing history. Inside, the walls trembled with whispers that traveled from one corner to another like sparks leaping across dry grass. Everyone had heard the words. Everyone knew the truth now. The boy who had been sentenced to life in prison was not just another name to be buried inside the files of the justice system. He was the son of the United States Attorney General. The man himself was now standing inside the courthouse, his presence reshaping the very ground beneath them. The boy stood beside his father, his cuffs still on, the orange jumpsuit still, marking him as a prisoner, but there was something different about him now. He no longer looked like a boy cornered by the system. He looked like the center of a story too large for anyone to control. His eyes carried strength, and his silence carried weight. For the first time since the gavel had fallen, people looked at him not as a convict, but as a symbol. A symbol of something unfair, a symbol of the questions no one wanted to ask but could no longer ignore. The judge remained seated at the bench, his gavel resting on the desk before him. His hands trembled slightly, though he tried to hide it. Authority had always been his shield, the robe on his shoulders, his armor. But now his authority was being questioned, not by a lawyer or a jury, but by the one man in the nation whose voice could reach above the bench itself. The Attorney General walked slowly toward the front of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing with a rhythm that silenced the room once more. His face was calm but firm, his jaw set, his eyes unyielding. Not there to argue, he was not there to plead. He was there to reveal the truth that everyone needed to face. He stood before the judge, his voice steady, low, but carrying through the entire chamber. "This," he said, gesturing to his son, "is not just another case. This is my son. And today this court has chosen to treat him as if his life holds no value, as if his mistakes are greater than his potential, as if his story is already finished. But I tell you this, his story is not finished. His voice will not be silenced, and the world will not forget what has been done here today." Gasps filled the courtroom. Reporters scribbled with frantic urgency, some nearly tripping over themselves to capture every word. The boy stood taller, his heart swelling with both pride and sorrow. He had called his father because he believed in him, because he believed in the justice his father spoke of every day. And now, watching him stand before the judge, he knew he had been right. His father was not here as a politician. He was here as a man who would not allow injustice to crush his own blood. The judge shifted uncomfortably. His lips pressed together, as though he wanted to speak but could not find the right words. The courtroom that had once been entirely under his command was slipping from his grasp. Every eye that had once looked to him for final authority now turned toward the Attorney General. The balance of power had shifted. The reveal of the boy's identity had rewritten the rules of the room. The father continued, his words sharp but filled with conviction. "Every child deserves fairness. Every child deserves a chance. Yet too often, the weight of judgment falls unevenly, punishing not only the guilty, but also the young, the vulnerable, the unheard. My son is one of many who stand accused, but, unlike so many, his story will be seen, his truth will be heard, because I will not allow this moment to vanish into silence." The boy listened closely, every word striking his heart like a spark against stone. He remembered the nights he had spent alone, feeling the system was too big for him to fight. He remembered the fear that had crept into his chest when the gavel came down. But now he felt something stronger rising. It was hope. It was courage. It was the belief that he was not powerless, not invisible. His father's words were not only for him, they were for everyone who had ever felt the cold weight of a sentence pressed too hard upon their shoulders. The judge finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "This court has spoken its judgment," he said, but the words sounded weaker now, like a candle flickering against a storm. The Attorney General turned his gaze toward him, steady and unflinching. "And now the nation will speak," he replied, "because justice does not belong to one man, or one bench, or one gavel. Justice belongs to all of us." The silence that followed was electric, charged with meaning. The courtroom was no longer a place of quiet endings. It had become a stage where truth was being revealed, where the power of one voice was colliding with the weight of the system. The boy lifted his head and looked at the faces around him. Some were filled with shock, some with doubt, but many were filled with something else, something he had not expected to see. Respect. The reveal had changed everything. He was no longer just a prisoner in an orange suit. He was a young man whose story had become a question mark for the nation. And as his father stood beside him, as cameras clicked and pens scratched, he realized that sometimes the most powerful weapon in the world was not anger, not violence, but truth revealed at the right moment. The gavel had fallen, but the sound of it was drowned out by the roar of a truth that could no longer be contained. And as the father and son stood together, side by side, the boy understood that this was not just his fight anymore. It was bigger than him, bigger than his family, bigger than the courtroom itself. This was about justice. This was about fairness. This was about hope for every voice that had ever been silenced. The reveal had been made, and nothing would ever be the same again. Asterisk, the courthouse doors swung open with a weight that shook the silence of the crowded lobby. Outside, the air was buzzing with voices, reporters calling out questions, cameras flashing like sudden bursts of lightning, the crowd surging forward to catch even a glimpse of the man who had become the center of the storm. The Attorney General walked through the chaos with measured steps, his tall figure steady, his shoulders square, his face calm but hard as stone. He was a man used to pressure, a man used to carrying the weight of entire laws and decisions, but this moment was different. This was not about politics, not about cases written in files or arguments made in courtrooms. This was about blood, about family, about his son who had been judged too quickly, condemned too icily, and sentenced as if his life had no future. Every camera turned toward him. Every microphone pushed closer, every reporter desperate to capture his words. But he said nothing. His silence was heavier than any speech. His eyes were locked on the path ahead, his mind sharp, his purpose clear. The boy, his son, was waiting inside, shackled by cuffs, marked by the judgment of a system that had already decided he would never walk free again. The Attorney General had heard the sentence, had heard the words life in prison. But he had also heard something else, his son's voice calling him. That call had pierced deeper than any headline, louder than any accusation. It was the call of a son who believed his father would come, and he had come. When he entered the inner hall, the noise from outside dimmed, as if even the building itself recognized his authority. Guards straightened as he passed, lawyers stepped aside, clerks lowered their eyes. They all knew who he was. His very presence seemed to bend the air around him. But behind the title, behind the power, was a father who carried love and fierce determination in equal measure. He walked through the corridors until he reached the room where his son was being held. For a brief second, he paused at the door, taking in a deep breath. He had stood before presidents, senators, and judges, but never had he felt the weight of a moment press so firmly against his chest. Then he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The boy stood from the bench as soon as he saw him. His wrists were still bound, but his back was straight, his eyes calm. In that instant, the father saw not a prisoner, not an accused, but his child, the boy he had raised with love and hope. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, nothing else mattered. Not the cameras outside, not the whispers of the crowd, not the gavel that had declared a life sentence. Father and son stood facing each other, one in the suit of authority, the other in the uniform of the condemned, yet bound by something far greater than circumstance. The Attorney General crossed the room, each step heavy with meaning, and placed his hand on his son's shoulder. His grip was strong, unyielding, filled with the promise that he was not alone. "I am here now," he said, his voice low but firm. The boy nodded, his chest swelling with quiet relief. "I knew you would come," he replied, though simple. Words carried more power than any argument, for they were built on trust that had not been broken, on a bond that could not be shattered by walls or sentences. Behind them, the guard shifted uneasily, uncertain whether to step forward or step back. They had never stood in a room where the rules bent under the presence of one man, where authority seemed to change hands with nothing more than words. The Attorney General turned his head slightly, his voice calm but filled with steel.
Amaya?
"Son is not to be moved until I say so." The guards looked at each other, hesitant, then lowered their eyes. His command was not loud, but it carried the weight of finality. The father then turned his attention fully to his son. "This is not the end," he said. "What happened in that courtroom is not the truth. It is only a decision made by men. And men can be wrong. The truth will stand, and I will fight for it. You are not alone in this." The boy's eyes glistened, but no tears fell. He refused to show weakness. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and nodded. He said softly. And in that moment, the father saw the same fire that burned within himself reflected in his son's eyes. The doors behind them opened again, and the murmur of voices spilled in. Reporters had found their way inside, their cameras raised, their pens ready. The sight of father and son together, one bound, one free. But both standing tall was more powerful than any headline they could have written. The flash of cameras filled the room, but neither the boy nor his father flinched. Instead, the Attorney General faced them directly. His voice was calm, deliberate, carrying the weight of both a father's heart and a leader's authority. "My son has been sentenced to life today," he said, "but I tell you this, his life is not over. Justice is not finished. This court may have spoken, but the truth has yet to be heard, and I will see to it that it is." The room erupted with questions, but he raised his hand and the noise faltered. His gaze swept across the sea of faces. "This is not just about my family," he continued. "This is about every child who has been judged unfairly, every voice that has been silenced before it had the chance to speak. What, today you see my son? But tomorrow, the world must see the system for what it is. And we will not stop until justice is more than a word spoken in courtrooms. It will be fairness lived in lives." The boy watched his father speak, his heart pounding, his spirit rising. He knew now that his call had not only brought his father into the room, it had brought the truth into the light. He was still in cuffs, but he no longer felt chained. His father's presence had broken the weight of hopelessness. Around them, the world shifted. This was no longer a simple case. This was a fight that would ignite conversations across the nation, and he was at the center of it. The Attorney General placed his arm around his son's shoulders, steady and firm. Together they stood as cameras flashed and questions roared. To the outside world, it looked like the beginning of a political storm. But to the boy, it felt like something deeper, something stronger. It felt like hope. The father had arrived, and with him came not just power, but truth. And nothing in that courthouse, no gavel, no sentence, no robe of authority, could stop what was now set in motion. Asterisk, the father and son stood together in the courthouse, the air around them buzzing with energy that felt heavier than thunder before. A storm. The boy's cuffs still pressed against his wrists, but his back was straight and his head was high, strengthened by the presence of his father. The Attorney General's arrival had shifted the entire atmosphere. What had been a room of quiet acceptance after a harsh sentence was now alive with questions, doubts, and a spark of hope that could not be ignored. Yet everyone knew the fight was not over. Sentence had been spoken, the gavel had fallen, and undoing that decision would take more than presence and words. It would take a challenge, one that would test not only the strength of the Attorney General, but the faith of the boy who had trusted him. The challenge began almost immediately. The reporters filled the room and cameras rolled, voices rose with pointed questions. Some asked whether the Attorney General was using his power to protect his son unfairly. Others asked whether this was a sign of corruption, a father bending the law for his own blood. Their questions came like arrows, sharp and fast, but the Attorney General stood calm, his voice steady, his words measured. "Justice is not about privilege," he said firmly. "Justice is about truth. And when truth is ignored, it is the duty of every person, whether father or official, to stand against it." His eyes swept across the reporters, silencing some. With his steady gaze, he did not flinch. He did not back down. He was not fighting for favoritism. He was fighting for fairness. That was his challenge, to prove to the world that this was not about power, about principle. The boy listened carefully, his heart steady, but his mind racing. He knew the battle ahead would not be easy. People would say he deserved the sentence. People would argue that his father was simply protecting him because of their bond. He knew the eyes of the nation would watch his every move, his every word. But he also knew something else, that the truth was on his side. The truth was stronger than any accusation. Later that evening, the challenge deepened as the Attorney General requested an emergency hearing. The courthouse lights glowed late into the night, and whispers ran through the corridors like restless spirits. The judge sat once again at his bench, though his authority now felt thinner than before. Lawyers gathered with their files, reporters filled the seats, and the boy was brought back into the room, his cuffs clinking with each step. He looked around and saw the faces staring at him, some filled with doubt, some with curiosity, and a few with quiet support. Took a breath and remembered his father's words. "Hold your head high, because the truth will rise." The Attorney General rose and addressed the court, his voice clear and strong. I stand here not only as a father, but as the guardian of justice for this nation. I do not ask for special treatment. I do not demand forgiveness for mistakes. What I demand is fairness. What I demand is a system that sees beyond fear and prejudice. What I demand is a chance for truth to be heard. His words echoed off the walls, stirring something even in those who had come expecting to see him falter. The challenge pressed harder when the opposing counsel rose. They argued that the boy had been given a fair trial, that evidence had been presented, that the law had spoken. They painted him as reckless, dangerous, unworthy of another chance. Their words were sharp, meant to close the door that the Attorney General was trying to open. But the father did not bend. He countered with questions, with facts, with a calm but unshakable logic that exposed cracks in their arguments. His strength was not in shouting louder, but in standing taller, in speaking with conviction that could not be dismissed. The boy sat silently, watching his chest swelling with both pride and fear. Ever seen his father like this? Not as a public figure on television, not as a man buried in work at home, but as a warrior standing in defense of justice itself. He realized now that his call had not only brought his father to his side, it awakened a fight that stretched far beyond him. The night stretched on, the arguments clashing like waves against rocks, but neither side gave way. The judge listened, his eyes weary, his fingers tapping against the gavel. For years he had held the final word in rooms like this. But tonight the challenge was greater than him, greater than the bench, greater than the walls of the courthouse itself. He could feel it pressing in the air, in the voices, in the silence that followed each statement. This was not just about one boy. This was about the system, about the future, about what justice truly meant. When the session ended, no decision was made. The judge declared that the case would be reviewed, that further hearings would be scheduled. It was not freedom, but it was not finality either. It was the beginning of a battle. And in that moment, the boy understood that the challenge was not just his father's, it was his as well. He would have to walk this path, endure the scrutiny, face the doubts, and hold his head high even when the world tried to push him down. As they left the courthouse together, father and son side by side, the boy glanced up at the night sky. The stars above shone faintly through the city lights, distant but steady. He thought of them as promises far away, yet still burning, reminders that hope never truly fades. His father placed a hand on his shoulder again, firm and steady. "This will not be easy," he said. "They will challenge us at every step. They will question, they will doubt, they will fight. But we will not give in, we will not bow, because the truth is stronger than any gavel." The boy nodded, his voice quiet but sure. "I am ready," he said. And he meant it. For the first time since the sentence had been spoken, he no longer felt like a prisoner waiting for the end, felt like a fighter standing at the beginning. The challenge was here, and he would not run from it. The courthouse behind them glowed. With light, the city outside hummed with voices, and the story of the boy and his father spread across the nation like wildfire. The challenge had begun, and it would test everything they were made of. But together, they would face it. And together, they would rise. The night after the hearing felt endless. The boy sat in his cell, staring at the faint glow of the moon that slipped in through the tiny barred window above him. The cold walls pressed in around him, yet his spirit no longer felt trapped. He thought of his father's words, the way he had stood tall in the courtroom, the way he had spoken about fairness and truth with a voice that carried more weight than stone. The boy realized that while the gavel had declared him guilty, the fight was far from over. Something had shifted. The world outside those prison walls was now awake. People were beginning to question whether justice had truly been served. In the morning, the noise began. Newspapers carried his story across their front pages. Headlines blared about the boy who had been sentenced to life, and the father who had stood as both Attorney General and parent.
Ow.
On television, debates raged. Some argued that the father was using his power to protect his son. Others said the case revealed something much deeper, that the system itself was uneven. That young people like him were often judged more harshly than others. His name, once unknown, was now being spoken in homes, offices, and classrooms across the country. His story had escaped the courtroom. It now belonged to the nation. Inside, the prison guards and other inmates looked at him differently. Some stared with suspicion, others with quiet respect. He kept his head high, not out of pride, but because he remembered what his father told him. Do not bow to despair. Hold your head high, because the truth will rise. And so he did. Every step he took in the yard, every moment he spent in silence, he carried himself with dignity. He refused to let the sentence define him. Meanwhile, his father moved swiftly. He launched a formal review of the case, pulling together teams of lawyers, experts, and investigators. Files were re-examined, evidence was tested, testimonies were questioned, and piece by piece, cracks began to appear in the foundation of the judgment that had been passed. The boy's father stood before the nation, not as a man seeking special treatment for his son, but as a leader shining a light on the flaws of the system. If this can happen to my son, he declared in a speech that aired on every major network, then it can happen to anyone's child. And that is why we must face this truth together. His words struck deeply in the hearts of parents, teachers, leaders, ordinary citizens who had seen similar struggles in their own communities. The turning point came not in a single dramatic moment, but as a wave of voices rising together. Communities began to speak out, not only for the boy, but for every young person who had faced unfair judgment. Letters poured into the Attorney General's office, some filled with stories of others who had been silenced, others filled with encouragement and support. The nation was no longer watching silently. The nation was speaking. Back in court, new hearings were scheduled. The boy sat in the courtroom once more, his father at his side, as fresh evidence was presented. Witnesses who had been overlooked were called to speak. The details that had been buried were brought to light. Each fact, each testimony, each revelation chipped away at the sentence that had seemed so final only days before. The judge who had once spoken with such certainty now sat quietly, his gavel untouched. The room that had once been filled with whispers of condemnation was now filled with the sound of truth unfolding. The boy felt the weight lifting slowly from his shoulders. He remembered the silence of the first day, the sound of the gavel, the despair that had tried to creep into his heart, and he remembered the phone call that had changed everything. That one call, made with steady hands and calm voice, had been the spark that lit a fire too large to contain. At last, after weeks of review, the moment came. The judge looked out over the crowded courtroom, his face lined with the burden of what had unfolded. He cleared his throat, his voice heavy. This court acknowledges the failures in the original case. The sentence of life in prison is hereby vacated. The words filled the room like thunder, but this time they did not crush. They freed. The boy closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. His father placed a hand on his shoulder, steady and firm, his eyes glistening. Though he did not allow the tears to fall, reporters leapt to their feet, cameras flashed, people gasped, and whispers turned into cheers. The boy's story had turned from despair to triumph, from silence to voice, from condemnation to hope. When he stepped out of the courthouse doors, the sunlight hit his face, warm and bright. The crowd erupted into applause and shouts of encouragement. He looked around and saw faces filled not with judgment, but with pride and hope. He was no longer just the boy in the orange jumpsuit. He was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, truth could find its way through. His father stood beside him, their shoulders nearly touching. "This is your turning point," he said softly, "but remember it is not just yours. It belongs to everyone who believed, everyone who fought, everyone who still struggles. Carry it with dignity." The boy nodded, his heart steady, his mind clear. He knew his journey was not over. There would still be challenges. Ahead, still doubts, still voices that would try to push him down. He had faced the heaviest blow and had risen. He had made the call, and the world had answered. As they walked together down the courthouse steps, father and son, the cameras captured every step, but the boy no longer felt like an image or a headline. He felt like a person whose story had meaning whose struggle had become strength. And he knew that somewhere another young person sitting in silence would hear his story and find hope in it. That was the true turning point. Not just freedom from a sentence, but the spark of change that lit in the hearts of others. His story had begun in silence, under the weight of judgment, but it ended with voices rising together, calling for truth, for fairness, for hope, and as the crowd's cheers echoed around him, the boy lifted his head to the sky. The future was uncertain, the road ahead unknown, but he no longer feared it. For he had learned that even in the darkest courtroom, even beneath the heaviest gavel, there was always a way forward. And sometimes all it took was one voice, one call to change everything.